Good morning. Welcome to the Wednesday, January 22nd, 2020 meeting of the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency, Placer County Airport Land Use Commission, and the Western Placer Consolidated Transportation Service Agency. Would you please stand for flag salute? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Allard. Here. Broadway.
Here.
Burris.
Here.
Clark-Kretz. Here. Holmes.
Here.
Joyner.
Here.
Mackey.
Here.
Euler.
Here.
Wright.
We will not have closed session this morning, is my understanding.
Correct.
So we'll move to item D, approval of the amended action item minutes for December 4th, 2019.
Move approval?
Do I have a second? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Thank you. Move to item E, agenda review. Does anybody have any items they'd like to pull from or move on the agenda?
I have none. No.
Madam Chair, we also have a revised consent and revised minutes with an administrative correction on the agenda. So there's one item added to the consent agenda.
Do I have a motion to approve the revised?
Move approval of the consent agenda with revised consent agenda.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion passes. Move to public comment. Do we have any public comment? All right, close public comment. Move to item G, amended consent calendar, Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. Do I have a motion to approve?
Move approval.
All those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion passes. Move to item H. Consent calendar for the Western Placer Consolidated Transportation Service Agency.
Move approval.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Move to item I, Riego Road Baseline Road Widening Project Initiation Document Evaluation Contract Award.
Good morning, Chair Beers. Congratulations, Chair of the Board. So we're excited about this project. This project's probably been in the pipeline for quite a while, or at least talked about. But about 6 months ago, we met with Placer County, Sutter County, and City of Roseville staff. We also included Sutter Point, Placer Vineyards, and Sierra Vista builders in this meeting, and we've been meeting for about 6 months, about monthly, and we think we have a project. So we are asking you to allow us to move forward on a project initiation document. This would be outside of Caltrans right away, and this project initiation document would allow us to move forward and go after local, state, and federal funding. The project, you see an exhibit up here, is to widen Baseline Road and Riego Road in Sutter County from State Route 99-70 for 12 miles all the way to Foothills Boulevard or Brady Lane. This is about a $100 million project. And PCTPA has been designated as kind of the administrative lead by Placer County, City of Roseville, and Sutter County, and we very much appreciate that. And so we would lead this project initiation document, and then we've set up the request for proposals, which I'm going to talk about in a second, so that we could move forward with environmental design and right-of-way kind of in a quick fashion, if you will. And so we actually released a request for proposals to do the project initiation document in December. We received 4 proposals, and Dewberry was selected as the first place team. And that name may not be familiar to you because they're an East Coast firm but they've just acquired Drake Haglin, which is a local Sacramento firm. And Drake Haglin will be leading the project initiation document. And if they do a good job to the satisfaction of Roseville, Sutter County, and Placer County, they would then continue with the environmental design and right-of-way. So today, you're just being asked to authorize $100,000 for Dewberry to move forward with the project initiation document. We hope to have that done by June of this year, and then we'll be pursuing local, state, and federal dollars. We believe well, let me back up just a second. If the sales tax measure passes, which we're going to talk about in the next agenda item, we believe that this project could then start construction in 2022. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from the board?
I have none.
Do we have any comments from the public? All right, I will move it back to the board for a motion.
Move approval of the item.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Noes? Abstentions? Motion passes.
Good job.
We will move to item J, Transportation Funding Outreach, January 2020.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. The item that you have before you today is to receive a presentation about the January 2020 polling for a potential transportation measure to be considered by the board later this year. This is in line with the scope of work that was approved by the board late last year, and that we've been marching forward on. So this morning, I will give a little short rendition of kind of where we're at. That will be followed by Kurt Balo with FM3, who will go over the survey in depth, and then Cherry Spriggs with FSB Core Strategies will do a short presentation on next steps, and then it'll return to me, and then back to you for discussion. We would be happy to answer questions as we go. For probably ease of use, it would be good to leave a lot of the questions towards the end, but I realize that with this survey, there may be some things in context that we want to kind of stop and ask specific questions on. So that is our recommendation today. So we are again on the track to, as approved by the board, to implement a funding outreach to the South District of the Placer County, along the lines of the legislation that we sought and were approved for the counties of Placer, Solano County, and San Diego County, Assembly Bill 1413, which allowed the contiguous cities of South Placer County to be considered for a potential ballot measure for transportation funding as a special tax. And so along the lines of our scope of work, our plan was to, throughout the end of 2019, to be out in the community and educating folks on the need for a local source of funding because of the gap that was created in the funding formula that was changed by the state and the federal government from a 90-10 or 80-20 to a 50-50 scenario. And as we've reported on many occasions, we literally used every means possible to get the word out, to drive people to the keepplacermoving.com website, to educate people through community meetings, sponsored events, mailers, and so on and so forth that are outlined in the staff report. Where we are at in the process in terms of considering this is, if you would, kind of step one. And that step one is, before you today, is to consider the geography of a proposed South County district. And the way that we had set up, and with your approval to do that, is to utilize and add an additional pole, a smaller pole or a tracking pole, if you will, to enable the board to see where the support is by jurisdiction. And then that would be considered today, and we will make a recommendation based upon the research today for that geography, and I'll get into that in a second. And then we would move on to the March meeting. At the March meeting, prior to the March meeting, we will conduct our final poll as per our schedule. That poll will be a more robust poll, very comparative to what we've done in the last 8 years, and will enable the board to consider whether we go or no go in terms of the transportation measure, if there is sufficient support in the eyes of the board. If that is the case, and we decide to go forward, the process from there on, as contained in a handout in the agenda packet, would be to go before each and every city council in the entire county to seek their support and approval of moving forward with the measure. It would then come back to the board. The board then would consider an ordinance which would place the matter on the ballot if the board so chose. Then it would go back to the Board of Supervisors when they normally consider all of the election items before them for a potential November 2020 item. This being one that could be included, the board would then decide to put that matter, those mini matters, if you will, on that November ballot. And then we would move into a private campaign, and we would take a step back as a public agency. So the recommendation that we have before you today is to not only receive the presentation, but based upon the results of this polling, determine which of the contiguous cities would be contained in a proposed South County district, and then move on to the March 2020 polling. So you'll see today, and we'll talk about this when it's a little bit more when Cherry and Kurt are finished. But based upon the polling, which you have before you today, you have a hard copy on your desk, and Kurt will go over it in depth. We are recommending that we move forward with the 3 cities of Roseville, Rocklin, and Lincoln, and that we not move forward with the town of Loomis based upon the results of the survey today. But we will go through that more in depth in the presentation that Kurt has. So very quickly before that, is there any quick questions before we start the presentation?
Doesn't sound like we have any.
Okay. All right, then we'll have Kurt come up and go through in detail a PowerPoint presentation on the actual survey.
Good morning. My name is Kurt Ballot from FM3 Research. We've been working with the agency for a number of years on past endeavors along these lines, and happy to be here to present the results of our most recent survey. Off the bat, I realized we probably should have taken the draft watermark off the slides. It's not a draft at this point. It's actually here in public. So I'm going to go through these in a little more detail. I think following on Mike's recommendation there, if you have a clarifying question about what's on one of the slides or something like that, maybe ask me as it comes up. If it's more about the implications of what it means, I think at the conclusion, and Cherry's going to talk to some of those as well, that might be the better time to talk about those implications. So a quick note about our methodology. We did this right after the holidays. This is very fresh survey data here. We did basically 600 interviews over the entire 4 city/town regions, plus an additional oversample of interviews in Loomis, given the size of that community, to make sure we have at least a little more certainty about those results. We did them on landlines and cell phones and online. So let me just go straight to the punchlines here, some of the data. So we asked some contextual questions in all these surveys. And we want to figure out where voters' heads are when they're considering something. And one of the most classic ones is both a warm-up question in a survey and also an important context is the old Gallup right direction, wrong track question. You see we have a few recent data points on this, 2017, just last February and this January. And you'll see that it's been vacillating a little bit here, but it's gone down. This is something that we have seen everywhere in basically California. A lot of issues related to housing, cost of living, probably trickle-down effects from what's going on in the federal government have contributed to the right direction numbers lower virtually every place we're looking in the Bay Area, which suggests a slightly less optimistic electorate. I think we may see some of the implications of that in these survey results potentially as well. It's not a unique thing compared to your communities here at all, by any means. Another set of questions we've asked in a few other surveys is the favorability questions. We ask them in a structure where we say there's some different types of entities in your community. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of them? We push the respondents a little bit to say whether they have a very or somewhat favorable or unfavorable opinion. They could also say, I never heard of them, or I've heard of them, but I don't have an opinion one way or another. Those are the different shades of gray bars. And you'll see here that Roseville, Loomis, and Rocklin had very strong favorable numbers in terms of perceptions, and those are only asked of residents of those communities. So we didn't ask people in Rocklin to rate Roseville. We wouldn't want to create any sort of like competition there, but they were just asked if they lived in those communities. In terms of the Board of Supervisors and your agency here, you'll see the numbers are somewhat consistent with the prior research we've had, which is more favorable than not. A whole lot of I don't knows, particularly for the agencies here, which is not an uncommon dynamic. Lincoln is a little bit further down the spectrum there at 42% favorable and actually flipped 51% unfavorable. And that's been a pretty consistent decline over the last couple of surveys. And I think Chair is going to talk a little bit more about Lincoln later bit on in the presentation. So the next two slides are problems battery or serious issues battery, are a series of questions that we ask. Here's things that people might think are problems in your community. You tell us how serious of a problem do you think it is, extremely, very serious, somewhat, or not too much of a problem. And that lets us know what are the burning issues that people are concerned about. And obviously, transportation-related issues and road-related issues are ones that you have jurisdiction over, but we ask a variety of other items in there as well as benchmarks to see how they compare. And so I don't know if you can think of a better name for the color of these things, sort of the dark mustardy color bars. The dark ones are the extremely serious problem, and the second to the left is the very serious problem. We've summarized those on the right. In our work, we're most concerned about issues that generate some intensity around them. And you'll see the top of the list. You have a couple things you don't have control over as an agency, really, healthcare and housing issues, but you see traffic congestion on local freeways and highways at the top of the list there as well. So this suggests that voters in these four communities, as much as they're concerned about healthcare costs, as much as they're concerned about the cost of housing, they look at traffic congestion on freeways and highways as a peer in terms of a problem. A few other items going down this list, and there's two slides in here, some of which are a little more directly related to you, which is issues around state and federal taxes and state government as a comparative. But traffic congestion on local streets is a bit of a difference from there, and traffic congestion on highways and freeways. And we have some issues around reductions in state and federal transportation funding, as Mike alluded to there. It's kind of in the middle of the range there. There's a lot of people don't really understand those mechanisms. Moving further down the list, you'll see a bunch of these items here where less than half the respondents felt like they were an extremely or very serious problem. A few of these are just comparatives like immigration issues, but we do have waste and mismanagement, local government, potholes, condition of local streets and roadways. They're much further down the list, particularly streets and roadways there. Only 30% feel that's an extremely or very serious problem. And a few of these, actually not a few, most of these we've been asked in the last several surveys, so we have some comparisons. And by and large, the differences from just last February to today are pretty minor. That's what we have that summarized in that last column there. In the sort of 0 to 5 point differences, so not particularly appreciable. The one that was really kind of interesting, which is that waste and mismanagement, local government, came down a lot. It actually looks much more similar to where it was 2 years ago, which suggests that either that particular response was a bit of an outlier last year, or there was something particular going on locally that really got people particularly agitated, and that's sort of regulated itself a little bit. But everything else looks pretty similar. This one's an interesting question, and I think may have some implications for looking at these results. And we touch on this in our concluding slides here, but we asked this question, and the italicized language is the exact question that was either read online or read on the phone, which is, do you think traffic congestion, broadly speaking, has gotten worse, stayed the same, gotten better? So that blue bar is a summary of those who feel like it's gotten better, and that sort of mustardy or brownish bar is those who think it's gotten worse. And the stay the same number is those gray ones on the bottom. You'll see here that the worst number is at 72%, with much worse at 44%. That's the fourth column there in 2020. And it looks somewhat similar to 2017. What's kind of a little bit surprising is that blue row, the better number. Last couple surveys, I get up here and make a joke and say, who are those 2% who think things have gotten better? But now it's 14%. So there's something that's appreciably different there. It's outside the margin of error. And a couple of different things that could be going on. One, obviously there's just always variability when you conduct surveys. You don't know exactly what you're going to get sometimes. Could also be we conducted the survey right on the heels of the holidays where people hadn't all gotten back to work yet, and maybe there was just fewer people commuting on a regular basis. I know that my parking lot in my office I can see the difference there, and now it's started to get more full as the month's gone on. It could also have been some of the work that's been done already at specifically the 8065 interchange. And I know that the agency has received positive feedback about that during their community engagement. So I think that is the worst numbers are still in the above 70%. Feel like it's getting worse. More than 4 out of 5 think it's much worse. But to see that 14%, that's an appreciable number there, and I think that's something we want to very much pay attention to in the next survey. So let's get to the tax itself. Here's the ballot language we tested. It's virtually the same as what we tested last year, with the one exception is that the last iteration had a 30-year sunset. This one uses the phrase "until repealed by voters" to suggest that there is no sunset. We wanted to see if there was a distinction there. But the spending priorities were all basically the same, and the mechanism and the rate were all the same. And here's what the results were. So 62%, a little more than 3 out of 5 voters who took this survey, those likely November voters, said they'd vote yes. 36% said they'd vote no, with more intensity on the yes side than the no side. And remember, we got to get to essentially 67% to pass, so it's still shy of that vote threshold there. When we took the Loomis voters out of the subsample, the initial support went up a point. So it went up a little bit.
She has.
Thank you. I have a question about that. I know the variance is only 1%, and I'm just wondering, I have 2 questions on this. One, what is the exact number percentage? Because I think when you're rounding, 0.555 would round up to 1, but I'm just wondering what that exact number is. And the other question I have is, I know you alluded to the fact that we have a higher sampling number. So did you roll back our weight for that? And if you could just explain that in a little bit more detail, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I can answer those in turn, and we have a couple other slides that dig into this a little more detail. I don't know what the exact percentage, if that was a 1.3 difference or a 0.9 difference. I can figure that out. I don't know that off the top of my head. The second part about the sampling is when we do an oversample in any community, what we do is then we do weight that back down to what its expected ratio would be. So that's not, that percentage and that difference is not buoyed by an oversample in Loomis. It has been weighted down to roughly a 3% percentage of the overall sample. As a point of comparison, in February, we were a couple points higher than this, but we've been in this 60% range for a number of surveys over the past several iterations. A couple of these we did break out here in this particular presentation by some of the demographic groups and geographic areas. So by political party, the yes vote was at 75% amongst Democrats, 66% amongst independents. The plurality of the voters in these areas are Republican, and they're about split pretty evenly. In terms of city, you see we're in the mid-60s with Rocklin and Roseville. It's actually a few points higher in Rocklin than we saw last year. Lincoln came down in the 54% range. It was a higher number last February. And Loomis really was significantly lower this go around, only 37% yes, and a pretty solid majority opposed at 58%. So as Mike mentioned earlier, in prior surveys, we've had a big 20-minute survey. We went through a bunch of potential spending areas. We asked individuals to rank those. We then would go through detailed pro and con arguments, many different variations of them. This was a much more concise survey. We just did a comprehensive, here's a bunch of, one reason why you should vote yes, and sort of the laundry list of things, and here's reasons why you might want to vote no, and rotated that. So half heard, positives yet first, and then the negatives, and the other half are the negatives and the positives. So after that all comes out and then wash at the end, we ended up at 56% yes. So there was a decline in support of 6 points. Again, it's a dynamic that we've seen in the prior research, where if there is an even exchange of arguments from both sides, the support does go down. What those arguments are, this is a lot of text to read. I think you've had this presented to you, so I'm just going to skip through these very dense slides here, but we hit through kind of the greatest hits from the prior research, and here are arguments in favor of a measure. Similarly, on the opposition side, we did do a little split sampling here, and we had more, one of the negatives had more of an anti-tax message, and one had a little bit more of a anti-development message, or the developers should be paying more from this, something that came out of some focus group research we did. At the end of the survey, there was very little difference between these two. But I think it was also interesting to see what the implications are of this exchange of supportive and critical information would be at the city level. Lincoln, virtually no distinction. Started off at 54% yes and went to 52%. Loomis, again, also really no change there, so you're still down well into the sub 50 range. And both Rocklin and Roseville lost a little bit of support down from the mid 60s to the mid upper 50s. And again, that's a dynamic we've seen consistently elsewhere. So I did note that we did rotate the order of the supportive and critical statements. So for half the sample that heard the positives first, they went from 62 to 65%. And if you exclude Loomis from the sample, that gets to 66. Still not quite to 67%, or 66.66, but closer. And you'll see that the after the pros and cons falls back down to roughly that 3 and 5 number. Another way we sort of like to gauge overall support for a measure is maybe that support, there's movement, but it's pretty small. That top line is pretty narrow. That could be masking people moving all over the place. And so we often look at the vote consistency, what's going on behind the scenes. And roughly half of the respondents, every time we asked them in the survey, all 3 times, said they'd vote yes. And the consistent no was roughly 3 out of 10, which means that there's a pretty good chunk there, about a quarter who are what we call swing. They're either undecided all the way through, or they were changing their minds one way or another. And so that's really where you need a very big portion of that 23% added to that consistent yes to reach 2/3. So the last couple of conclusions here before I hand it over to Cherry is you still have, as you've always had, a very solid majority of voters in the community, however it was defined in the past, who are inclined to support a measure of this nature, but you're just falling a little below that 2/3 vote threshold. Again, that's also been consistent over the years as well. The weakest of the 4 communities was clearly in the survey was Loomis, and we never got even into the 40% yes vote there. There was a majority of support in Lincoln, but that was much lower than we saw last February. And I think Cherry's going to talk a little bit about that later on here. That was one of the areas also there was a noticeable decline in support. We almost get to 2/3 if you, after the positives only, and changing the restrictions to just have those 3 different cities in there. So very, very close. I think that when I talked about the 2 different sort of critical frames, the anti sort of development or developer should pay more frame versus just the straight more anti-tax, those had similar levels of impact. And I think that one thing that we were talking about and after this is looking for a March survey or the presentation in March is that would be a one last time to really take all the information we've accumulated over the last couple of years and really look critically at those 75 words and see if there's ways that we can change that based upon what we've seen in this research, because that's really, we're having a tough time really punching through that ceiling. And is there something that we can do in those 75 words that will resonate more strongly with voters? And we want to make sure that we're putting our best foot forward in the next round of research. Last couple things I think are helpful when taking into consideration just these results is there's a little less optimism out there amongst voters. That right direction number went down to 62%. That's not uncommon. In a lot of different communities, more conservative, more liberal, more rural, more urban, we're seeing that sort of just general, I don't want to use the word malaise, but there's just a little more hand-wringing about the future, and we've seen the implications of that in other finance measures in other communities as well. So that's not a surprising thing here, and I think it's useful to keep that in the back of our head, and what things will look like this November is uncertain. In terms of city government, I think the views of city government are pretty positive in 3 communities. Lincoln has had a decline in that over 17, 19, and 20. And the other thing I think it's worth keeping in mind here is this traffic thing. I noted that before, but it just was a little head scratching that 14% feel like it's gotten better. I think it could have been an issue of timing. It could have been an issue of you're doing your job too well in some regards. And people are like, well, there actually has been an improvement here. And that may be a double-edged sword there. So I think that gets me to the end of my section. And if Mike, following your cue, Cherry's going to go, and then we'll do the more strategic implication type questions.
Yes.
All right, great.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I don't have any slides, but I am just going to kind of run through some thoughts that I prepared once I had a chance to look at the research that came back over the weekend. So the FM3 presentation, and this survey in particular, and as mentioned, was designed really to understand what a district looks like. We're all working here for the agency and working together to ensure that whatever measure is put before voters is a successful one, and I can't think of anything really more detrimental to the effort at this point than to impose a community into a district that doesn't want to be there. And I think the numbers show this. Historically, the numbers have shown this for Loomis. I think there's a number of anecdotal pieces that we all have heard from being just out and about that mimics this. I think Loomis residents don't want this, and I think that it very much, they see it as it being imposed upon them, and I really do think that that harms the outreach effort moving forward. I think when we look at this, the benefits that we all talk about for Loomis, you know, Horseshoe Bar, 8065, or Safe Routes to School, we see those, but the community is not seeing those, and they're not, and the numbers are not showing that. I think with the legislation and what we all had to go through to get the legislation, the agency right now has a chance to really not to repeat history with this meeting here today specifically. Of course, it's always an honor to stand here before you, and I have done it now a couple times over the years, and I have had the pleasure of working with many of you individually and very closely on this, and I don't think I've ever said this would be easy. I think I've always said we have our work cut out for us in doing this, and I think for the agency to put together a measure that can transition to a private campaign and be successful, we really have to retain every voter, and when I say we, I really actually mean that measure. Whatever the measure is put before voters, you really have to retain every vote that you got in 2016 from Roseville, Rocklin, and Lincoln, and that's not even factoring in Loomis, but removing Loomis from the district gives us a chance. It returns some support to us, and we have to look at that, and moving into that next piece, you know, again, removing a community that doesn't want to be in and has been very vocal about not wanting to be in this district. But I do want to talk about Lincoln a little bit. Historically, the numbers in Lincoln have been very high. Everybody here knows the challenges that Lincoln has faced over the last few years, and the council is working on those, and the city manager, you know, making strides in that regard. But it's just, I think this research should tell us that we can't rest on our laurels. We can't just assume that the support is going to be there that we had in 2016, because we face so many different challenges now than what we did back then. So I continue to believe, professionally and personally, that Lincoln does stand the most to gain with this expenditure plan. And I think with continued education, now just focused on essentially what would be 3 cities in this district. You know, we have 8 weeks more or less till we get into that new poll after the primary to get those numbers in Lincoln back to where they traditionally have been. And I think using this time to do everything we can, and I'll talk about a few of the adjustments that we're making to our plan in a second, but using this time to prepare. As Kurt mentioned, the survey that we'll have in March will be much more similar, much more robust to the surveys that the agency has commissioned before. So we really want to put our best foot forward there as it relates to Lincoln. So with that, I'll just work towards my close here. Next step. So like I mentioned, we looked at this survey research over the weekend, and so what is running from now until essentially the end of March in the what would be district-wide, for lack of a better term. We've got our movie theater advertisements. We have digital advertisements running again. Paul, I saw you jumped in on some of them. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. We have electronic billboard advertisements that will be running. Our first mail piece hit last week district-wide. We'll have 2 additional pieces that will be hitting district-wide. We have a kiosk coming online at the Roseville Galleria that will enable to have people come and ask questions. They'll be able to see the different videos that we've produced. And then, of course, continued our earned media and community speaking engagements that we have. So that's happening everywhere, like Roseville, Rocklin, Lincoln, in the district. That's all happening. But looking at Lincoln, we want to put some extra attention there. And we are looking at doing 2 additional mail pieces to Lincoln over the next 8 weeks. Doing additional digital advertising there that would just be Lincoln specific, and a town hall meeting, community events, and then in partnership with other organizations like Friends of McBean and the Lincoln Chamber that we would roll out over the next 8 weeks too, in advance of this next survey. So I will close today just by saying that with the data that we have today, the historical data that we have, and all of these qualitative pieces that we all have, from working in this space for as long as we have, it's clear again that I don't think that Loomis residents want to be in this district, and I do believe honing in on the geography of the district and the boundaries allows our team to further focus educational efforts on those jurisdictions where they want to be included, and there's support for the measure. So with that, I'll turn it back to Mike.
Thank you, thank you, Cherry and Kurt. Just to summarize, again, our recommended action is not only to receive the presentation, which you've done, but to actually take action to determine what the district is moving into the March polling. And our recommendation to you, based upon the research, is to have the 3 cities of Rocklin, Roseville, and Lincoln move forward into that next survey, and then to continue on with that survey. One comment I did want to make related to the 14% that Kurt and Cherry discussed, and it's and why we should focus in on the March survey. As you know, I think there was probably a direct correlation to the completion of Phase 1 of 8065. We received an unbelievable amount of positive feedback. Thank goodness you did this. This helped me get to where I'm going. But what kind of happened right in the middle of the survey is that, as we predicted, people came back to Highway 65. And so now every single weekday night, we have a large amount of traffic congestion that happens between essentially Galleria and Blue Oaks. So the knot of traffic moved north. And we're starting to just get feedback on that, like, well, wait a minute, you just finished this thing, and why is it bad again? And it's because we haven't been able to widen Highway 65, which is our next project in line to widen southbound and to look at northbound 65. So I think as we get closer to March, we have that, probably a more realization that, hey, things, they got better temporarily, but we got a long ways to go. So I think that is another reason to focus in on the March survey being the if you will, go, no go deciding factor, and we'll have everything brought to you along those lines. A couple things, miscellaneous things I wanted to mention. In your packet, you do have the we call countdown to election day, or the tentative schedule of if we move forward in March. Also in your attachment is the latest revision to the expenditure plan. As you know, we make adjustments to this as we as we move forward because there are changes in project costs that we have to update, and other minor adjustments that our member agencies ask for. And so included in this version, we call the January 2020 version, is an adjustment to add Nicholas Road into the interchange program as a long-range project and needed in the Lincoln area. We added that in there and again made some adjustments to project costs. But otherwise, it's stated it's $1.2 billion over 30 years, which matches our sales tax projection from HDL Companies, our sales tax consultant. So with that, I'll end our presentation to you, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Any questions, comments from the board?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to let everybody know Loomis leadership is really disappointed in the numbers, but the numbers don't lie. I wanted to thank Mike and his crew for really fighting hard to make sure that Loomis got the message. And I know that Sherry alluded to the fact that, our citizens weren't in favor, but not all of them. Leadership was behind this 100% and will always be. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, there's miscommunication or some sort of other issues that are swaying those voters. And I would also say that not only Lincoln stands the most, but Loomis would have stand the most also. I just want to finish by saying, again, we support the sales tax measure, but our traffic is definitely affected by the region in which we live in. Our population has not increased, and that's, just a fact for Loomis, and unfortunately. But anyway, we do 100% stand behind your recommendation, and we support your measure. I just wanted to let everybody know how we felt, so thank you.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions about the survey results. I don't know who would answer them, but first of all, I just wanted to ask a question about slide 5. The heading of that slide is "The condition of roads ranks low on the list of perceived problems." I'm a little confused because we actually have 2 questions about local roads in the survey, which could skew the results. The first one is about potholes and deteriorating local streets and roads. That was 41%. Then you go down towards the bottom, the condition of local roads, streets and roadways, that's 30%. I wonder what the difference would have been if you had taken one of those out and had just asked a direct question about whether it's the potholes or the condition, and you would have come with a higher number.
Yeah, and it's astute of you to point that out. I think I was remiss in not mentioning that all these items in this question were split sampled, so people didn't get the entire list of them. And for some of these items, like roads and like the traffic congestion on local streets versus the freeways, we often put those in separate split samples to not have this confusion issue, but just to see if slightly different ways of phrasing something generate different types of responses.
Okay.
And so for traffic congestion, you see there's a 10-point sort of difference between freeways and highways and the local roads. And then for here, it was more like, well, the roads are falling apart, is that a big problem, versus broadly the condition of them. And it seems like there was more intensity around the potholes, but they were not asked, respondents were not asked both of those.
Okay, I wanted to clarify that.
No, that's a good question.
Another question on slide 11. Were you surprised by the small number of undecideds that came in this survey? When I saw the numbers, I was really surprised. I thought we would have more undecided.
Not typically with sales taxes. Usually the biggest way when there's a lot of indecision about a local finance measure, or even a statewide measure for that matter, it's usually about the mechanism itself is complicated. So utility users tax, for example, when we ask about those, you see fewer of those measures these days, but people get really confused. What service is it on and what's being taxed on? And you'll see in our surveys routinely 20% or more of respondents say, I don't know because I don't understand what you're asking me about until we provide an explanation. Those 75 words just can't do justice to a complicated tax measure. Sales taxes people get. And typically we see less single-digit undecided numbers for sales tax measures just because that mechanism is something they understand. Either they like it or they don't, or they're, I mean, that's the right word, they're either accepting of it or they're not. And then they have other factors that come into play, whether they feel like trust money will be spent appropriately, what have you. So I think those numbers are low, but not out of the ordinary for this type of mechanism.
Okay. And then this might be a question for Mike. If it's decided that Loomis is taken out of this, and I know the Loomis leadership, I've talked to a number of you, I know you're fully behind this thing and have definite needs for transportation funding, especially Horseshoe Bar. What would the dollar impact be as far as revenue raised if Loomis is taken out? Especially, have you calculated in if a Costco goes into Loomis?
So to answer the first question, the Loomis has projects in two parts of the proposed expenditure plan. They have the Horseshoe Bar interchange is in what we term the interchange program, and quite frankly, that program is oversubscribed to a certain extent. We have more projects in there than we probably have money for, but it was done purposefully because it was kind of a first come, first serve as needed when the timing is right. And so now, there's $85 million in there. You'll probably need the $85 million to cover the matching funds for Rocklin Road, Nelson Road, and Nicholas Road. So I wouldn't say we would adjust that category at all. The category we would propose to adjust, though, is the local program, where 25% of the proposed $1.2 billion expenditure plan, as you know, goes to the cities for their expansion needs for roadways in the county and other transportation items, and that is divided by as most of our transportation dollars are, is divided by population and road miles. And so we would take Loomis's amount, which as it stands right now is about $303,000 per year, and that would be redistributed over the other jurisdictions. I should note in that same category, there is, although they're not part of the measure, there is a allocation for Placer County, but that allocation is set aside for those county roads that benefit the cities in accordance with the legislation. So essentially, a quick explanation is the connective roads between the cities, or something like Baseline Road. So those would be the two items that we would adjust. So it's not a big adjustment, if you will, with Loomis being out. And certainly, we can in March we can have a healthy discussion on is if there's any other items that you would wish to replace Horseshoe Bar Road with, or the such. Or any discussion you want to have today about that. We certainly can do some research about other items, but at this point we see it as a relatively minor adjustment.
So I probably didn't phrase my question properly. So I'll ask a different question.
Okay.
What would the sales tax revenue generated, how much would it be reduced with Loomis being out of the district?
Okay. The revenue being reduced, I don't have that number. We didn't do that analysis, but I would say a very small amount. The revenue, the sales tax revenue generated, and certainly I'll bring that number back to you in March, but or give it to you between now and March. But most of the sales tax is generated in the three larger cities. I would say probably less than 3% is generated in Loomis right now. Now, if you add the Costco in, certainly that would go up a little bit. It's one Costco does not fundamentally change the whole revenue from sales tax for the whole county. Certainly, it's very significant for Loomis, but adding one Costco to the whole mix of the whole county is when you look at the whole generation for all the cities is not that significant.
We have a comment over here.
Yeah, so I just wanted to understand, I know in 2016, we went for Measure M. Countywide, we were, I think similarly close in our polling numbers as to what you guys are now for just the 3 cities within the county. If this was to move forward, does that preclude us from looking at a countywide sales tax in the future that would service the rural areas in North Lake Tahoe? And
No, you could, I guess I should start with a caveat that Assembly Bill 1413 was the state added some significant complexities to now, I mean, it helped us, but it added complications to how we add things on later. So right now, if we wanted to include the unincorporated area, we would have to include the entire unincorporated area. So we couldn't take a portion of it. So, because the legislation says it's either all or nothing. And we chose, or we recommended that we don't go to the all, because that gets us back in the same place as a countywide measure before. Now, if in the future, we wanted to go back and ask the state for amendments, that's certainly possible. And I think the 3 counties and the group of self-help counties are hoping that this, the state kind of considers this a pilot project for those 3 counties, and these 3 counties are very hopeful that it's if that's a decision they choose, that it'll be a benefit to those 3 counties, and that the state will view that as, okay, well, we can allow some adjustments to be made. So, and hopefully those adjustments would allow us to say add a portion of the county, especially in our case where you have, for instance, the basin actually has the ability to generate its own sales tax. So in the future, we might want to pursue. We wouldn't want to pursue a double, measure in the basin and outside the basin. We might want to just consider something outside the basin, because the inside the basin already has the ability to do that. So I think our mode, if we wanted to add something in the future, would be we'd go back to the state and say, please adjust this for us and for several other counties.
okay, thank you.
All right, any further comments from the board? All right, do we have a motion or direction? Oh, sorry. Do we have any comment from the public?
Good morning. Mike Garabedian for Placer County Tomorrow. So 4 years ago, the first time I spoke to this board, maybe about half of you were there, I'm not sure, I explained why the ballot measure was not going to pass. I explained in that case how Senator Roseanne Vuich got her Fresno 401 freeway, and I won't go into detail that again, by asking for the most important thing and not everything else all the freeway boosters wanted. A bit of a story there. So this time I'm going to continue that story, however, about my role in that. There were 4 women running for state senate that year. 3 others were supposed to win. Roseanne did. She hired me as her coordinator in Fresno. So Roseanne was a strong supporter of the need for property tax reform. Remember, this was 1976, 2 years before Prop 13. And so I wrote a TV spot for her about her support for property tax reform, but the Genius ad man did a really good job with what I wrote. Then someone explained to Senator Vuich that her opponent, the assemblyman nested in half of the district, had introduced a measure, a state legislative resolution asking Caltrans to fund the right-of-way. This right-of-way was empty and through downtown Fresno. There was no environmental opposition to it, and Assembly Mobley, couldn't get it built. So the They took away the property, they took off the property tax reform measure and put on a TV spot about, quote, the road to nowhere with future Senator Lewis standing there at the street crossing where the interchange with 99 had been built for Highway 41, but it was not built north of a street there. So that issue caught on very big in the district, and that really elected her in Fresno County. The district at that time was basically eastern Fresno County, Tulare, Kings County, and the northern central part of Kern counties. And she was down 17 points in Fresno County when I started helping her out, and she won by, I think, a couple thousand vote margin in that county as well in the others. So I think there's a very strong measure about the relationship of taxing the public to do things that they need and don't need. In this case, we think that anybody that looked at the ballot measure 4 years ago could see that it wasn't something that was needed, that they needed to vote for. Probably half of you have not seen the policy brief by the UC Davis on congestion that we used heavily 4 years ago that shows that increasing capacity does not reduce congestion, maybe for a little while. So here we are again, back with a lot more information that's very helpful, important to understand. The key thing here is what the voters think is necessary, and we think if they, just looking at what was up here, they were not, the opposition was not explained. It was not explained about how the facts say that congestion doesn't relieve what they hope will happen here. So they haven't heard both of the sides. The other night at the Jessup, the presentation by the four city, sponsored by the 4 city chambers of commerce, did not have the opposition there, did not have the counter arguments. And like you were just told, if the public gets the counter arguments, you know, that you're going to have trouble with this again. So I don't know that there's any point to go into much detail now, but if past actions continue, then I will be back when you try to do this again with the rest of the story about Senator Roseanne Vujic and how to get a freeway built that's really needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more comments from the public?
John Rebate, Loomis Town Manager. I just wanted to echo Jan's sentiments of the town staff. Certainly disappointed in the results. We'll do whatever we can do to help the measure pass for the rest of the county. And the answer to John's question is about 600,000 without Costco, maybe 1.5 with it, if the half-cent sales tax goes in Loomis. So.
Thanks, John.
Any more comments from the public? All right, I'm going to bring it back to the board for action. Any discussion? All right, do I have a motion?
Move approval.
Second. There's two items up for approval. Is which of the 4 South County contiguous cities, towns? So did you have the 3 that you wanted in?
I'm moving approval of the staff's recommendation.
So Rocklin, Roseville, Lincoln. Two motions? Okay.
We would ask you to clarify which 3.
Yes, so
Which of the
if I could get a clarified motion, if there are 2 motions on the table.
Okay, so the motion that I'm moving is that we move forward with this item with the 3 cities that have been recommended by staff to be included in the district.
Second. Okay. Sylvie, could I ask for a roll call vote?
Sure. Allard.
Yes.
Broadway.
Yes.
Burris.
Yes.
Clark-Kretz. Yes. Holmes.
Yes.
Joyner.
Yes.
Mackey.
Yes.
Euler.
Aye.
Wright.
Motion passes.
And now we need a motion, I will move to direct staff to proceed with the polling plan for March 2020.
All right. Ayes? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye?
You want to?
Let's do a roll call.
Okay, let's do a roll call.
Allard,
Yes.
Broadway.
Yes.
Burris,
Yes.
Clerk Pretz. Holmes,
Yes.
Joyner,
Yes.
Mackey,
Aye.
Euler, Wright.
All right, thank you. Now moving to item K, board direction to staff.
Madam Chair and members of the board, although we don't have an executive director's report, we thought we could take a couple minutes to talk about a very important tour that we have coming up with some key transportation officials in the state, if that's okay with you.
Yes, absolutely.
And I'll let Luke talk about that as he's kind of taking the lead on this particular tour.
So over the past, probably year and a half, we've been working on the Placer Sacramento Gateway Plan. Hopefully you're familiar with it. There's been a lot of surveys. We actually received 5,000 surveys from users on the corridor. We've done a lot of community meetings and outreach. And I'll keep this relatively brief, but as Mike mentioned, the state and federal's contribution to transportation projects has dropped from 80 or 90% down to about 50%. But 50% of a project's still a fair amount. So we still want to aggressively pursue state and federal funding, but of course we need a local match to do that. So if the sales tax measure does pass, I think we have a great opportunity where we put ourselves where we can aggressively pursue state and federal dollars. And so we actually have the honor of the CalSTA, California State Transportation Agency, Secretary David Kim is going to come and tour Placer County. And we really appreciate his time. We also got the Deputy Director of Caltrans, Jim Davis. He'll be on the tour also. We're reaching out to our state and federal electeds. And of course, we're reaching out to our local electeds also. But we're going to start in Lincoln, and we're going to start at the Park and Ride lot near Lincoln Boulevard, and we're going to go down Highway 65, and it's going to be nice and congested during that time, hopefully. It is all day, so I'm pretty sure.
You're actually hoping it will be good.
The state's interested in different types of projects than maybe this board's used to. We're not going to be highlighting Baseline Road and a bunch of things like that. We're going to be talking more about multimodal, so transit, bike, and ped. And that's really what the state, with the executive order from Gavin Newsom, that's the only way they will spend money. But that's an important part of our transportation system also. And so we want to secure those dollars. And so we'll be going down Highway 65, talking about some commuter buses. We'll be going down Interstate 80 all the way down to Sacramento, and we'll be stopping at the Sac Valley Station. And of course, this is all coordinated with Sacramento, so we'll have Sacramento County supervisors, City of Sacramento supervisors, and Citrus Heights also in kind of a great partnership. So just wanted to highlight that. It's going to occur on Tuesday next week, February 28th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Then this Tuesday, January 28th. Yeah, next week from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. And the CTC meeting, the California Transportation Commission meeting, is the next day. And so Paul Van Keneinenberg and a couple other commissioners also will be on the tour. And this, of course, is very important because they decide who gets the money from the state. So with that, we just wanted to give you a quick update.
Thank you. All right, do we have any board direction to staff? All right, we have some informational items. But aside from that, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Second.
We're adjourned.
Thank you.
How do you know? You didn't take